So the president of the United States has taken a very specific ideological political position to push back on people who are all that concerned about the virus, including people who are within his own administration. Fauci, for example, he is trying to discredit Fauci because Fauci is basically trying to be honest and say, yeah, we never actually got through the first peak of this virus, and now we're in a second peak because the administration and many of the people who are in the various states focus the priority on the economy as opposed to eliminating the virus first. Fact of the matter is, the entire reason that the economy was shut down was because of the virus, not because of anything in and of itself, but because of the virus, a real thing that intersected that was going to get a lot of people ill, that would have forced the economy to shut down. Anyway, our thought was, let's keep people well, put them in their homes, deal with issues of social distancing, make sure they wear a mask if they're going into institutions that don't have a choice but to be open because of food and so forth. But basically, shut it down. If you were reopening before dealing with the actual reason you shut it down in the first place, conceivably, the virus is going to expand and propagate. On top of that, especially when you get into the notion of bars and you get into the notion of ideological positions that some people take on issues of science, which in and of itself is bizarre, and yet has real world consequences of, again, potentially spreading the virus. If they themselves don't necessarily get sick, it doesn't stop them from necessarily being spreaders of that particular illness to people who will get sick. The president of the United States not necessarily wanting to recognize this, despite the fact that the American public believes this. Don't open it back up until it's clear that people are safe. The president don't want to hear anything about that. So the president puts out this tweet. Cases, cases, cases. If we didn't test so much successfully, we would have fewer cases. If you test 40 million people, you're going to get many cases that without the testing, like other countries, would not show up every night in the fake evening news. And a certain way, our tremendous testing success gives fake news media all they want, cases. In the meantime, deaths and all-important mortality rate goes down. You won't hear about that from fake news, and you never will. Almost anybody need any ventilators. The reality, despite what Trump is trying to promote, that basically the issue is testing. Testing is the problem. We test so many people that the fact that we test so many people, we're getting results. Unfortunately, reality doesn't necessarily bear that out. First thing, the whole let the weak die off herd immunity stuff, not so much. Spain's coronavirus antibody study adds evidence against herd immunity. Arizona County requests refrigerator trucks as morgues hit 97% capacity during the pandemic. Those are deaths. That's not an issue of testing. That's an issue of death. You believe that a person got tested and then made the choice to die as opposed to dying separate and distinct from whether or not the person was tested, meaning that guy would have died regardless of whether or not the person was tested. Here's the other point, right here. The curve is no longer flat. Nearly half of Florida's ICU are 90% full. Again, that's not an issue of testing. A person is not going to the ICU because they got tested. They go into the ICU because they're on the brink of death. All of Houston hospitals are full. In Houston, overwhelmed ICUs leave COVID-19 patients waiting in ERs. So many people are ill and on their deathbeds that they don't have room for them in the ICU, so Houston is just leaving them in the emergency room. 2 days ago, the deaths, 849. When I used to look at the death toll before, this number was, I think, at like 1,200. The fact that this number has started to go back up should give pause, especially for people like me who've been saying the death toll will go up conceivably if you reopen the economy too early before eliminating the virus. And because the priority in this was the owner class, the 1%, that's where the money went when they gave all the money away. And for that matter, reopening, because Jeff Bezos is not necessarily going to be in these particular stores. So I would imagine people like him want it open. Well, you've gotten it open. 849 deaths 2 days ago. Yesterday, 731 deaths. Again, when I used to watch it, look at this number, it used to be 1,200. This is getting and creeping back up. This is not a factor of testing. This is a factor of the virus expanding because due diligence wasn't done in order to deal with it. Now, continuing with the ideological point of view, Donald Trump wants schools open. We must open schools. We got to get these kids back to schools. And his henchmen, Betsy Devos, who basically got the job because of her donation to hundreds of millions of dollars to Republicans, and now she's in this position charter school hero or warrior. And in this very specific instance, her concern, just like other right-wingers who are unempathetic, is basically put the kids back in school. She is going to have a disastrous interview that I'm going to show you with a reporter, Dana Bash, who asking the most basic of questions that should be asked with a certain degree of severity and priority, considering these are children that we're going to put in harm's way. Devos did not come out of that looking well. But basically the mantra is kids are going back to school. Donald Trump went so far as to say he would try to withhold money if those states or those localities didn't open their schools. Betsy Devos, failing miserably at her job and most likely is going to start killing kids. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you the opportunity for allowing me to do it. Let's take a look at Betsy Devos, Dana Bash, CNN, kids are going back, and right-wingers are continuously trying to make this argument that kids are somehow either are not affected by COVID-19 or somehow won't have a propensity to spread it. Not to mention, even if your kid is not necessarily one of the people who have the highest propensity for death, why do you want your kid to have to endure it at all and have to deal with that potential at all, as opposed to ensuring that the virus is down? Many of the other countries that are opening up their economies and letting the kids basically come through are countries that have settled the virus and have numbers that have been on a dwindling path. The United States, the number has been going up severely day by day by day. The notion that you're going to send kids back in that condition is appalling. Are there other ways where we can do our education that doesn't necessarily force those kids to go back to school? I think the answer is yes. And you have several months to get to it. Are you saying you're not competent enough to do so? To make that much more plain, Betsy Devos doesn't even have a plan for the various schools and how those schools can keep those kids safe. And yet, she wants them to go back in conditions that could get those kids killed, or for that matter, get people who those kids engage with killed. Let's take a look at Devos.
What happens if there's an outbreak? What are experts telling you about the appropriate level of transmission for a school before it has to shut down?
Well, I know that that's an area that the CDC is helping to provide further insight into. I can't, as a non-physician or a non-medical expert, tell you precisely what to do in the case of one child in a classroom or five children in a classroom. But the key is every school should have plans for that situation to be able to pivot and ensure that kids can continue learning at a distance if they have to for a short period of time.
You're the Secretary of Education. You're asking students to go back. So why do you not have guidance on what a school should do just weeks before you want those schools to reopen? And what happens if it faces an outbreak?
You know, there's really good examples that have been utilized in the private sector and elsewhere, also with frontline workers and hospitals. And all of that data and all of that information and all of those examples can be referenced by...
Think about what she's saying for the moment. Think about what she's saying. The federal government wants schools to open. Okay. The various localities, all of them understand, okay, how are we going to open in conditions that could be unsafe for the children who are in our charge? Betsy Devos is basically saying, hey, there's all sorts of information out there for you guys to figure it out on how to keep you guys safe. Now, assuming for the moment that this takes place, you're going to have certain areas that have certain disparities in the way that those kids are dealt with as opposed to others. Meaning you may have a state like Massachusetts that finds some kind of novel way of dealing with it to keep their kids safe, with some other state like Texas that does not. You, in your job as Education Secretary, has a certain responsibility to look at all of those studies out there, to talk to the various people out there, to ensure that there are provisions financially and policy-wise to ensure that those kids are safe. It should not be up to the various localities to come up with some kind of slap together proposal of dealing with that. That should be your job, especially since you are taking the perspective that those kids need to go back. The least you can do is ensure they go back safely. Dana Bash is going to continue to push her on this. Let's hear the clip. Let's hear more.
Okay,
Leaders
but I'm not hearing a plan from the Department of Education. Do you have a plan for what students and what schools should do?
So schools should do what's right on the ground at that time for their students and for their situation. There is no one uniform approach that we can take or should take nationwide.
But can I just ask you?
That's just it. It should be. If I do science and I find out that a certain thing is true, up to this point, there's been a certain uniformity in the way that science is, let's say, dealt with in regards to our world when we're pursuing it. That's not true as an absolute. If you're at relativistic speeds or if you're in these kind of strange processes that go beyond what we typically engage with on a human level, you may get different states of matter, you may get different phenomena that take place, but all things being equal, there's a certain uniformity with how that stuff works. The notion that you're the education secretary and you're telling all of these people to make a choice on what's right for them, this is not an issue of a choice on what's right for them per se. You should have some level of guidance. There should be something that you need to put through from the standpoint of policy that explains how to go about ensuring that those schools are safe. That's not something that's dependent upon the school or the area. That's something that is, in this case, uniform approach. I mean, if your pathway to this is saying all kids need to stay 6 feet apart, or for that matter, all kids need to wear masks from point A to point B, not to mention the schools need to ensure that they're XYZ, like whatever that guidance is, it is up to the federal government to ensure that each of those schools have a clear understanding of what they're supposed to do in order to keep those kids safe, especially since it's the federal government that is being overbearing and trying to force those kids back to school. I hope you understand what I mean. Her trying to throw this off on the various localities is somewhat of a kiss-off. They're taking an ideological position and then trying to leave it up to the various localities to fulfill their own ideological position. I don't care if the kids go back to school immediately. The school in and of itself is not necessarily a real thing. The education process can take place outside of them going into a brick and mortar building. The school itself is not a brick and mortar building. I hope you understand what I mean. The school is kind of the atmosphere of learning that takes place, and that does not necessarily have to be in that specific building. It's like the difference between what people would consider to be a soul versus the person. If that soul was dropped into another body, that body at that point becomes the identifier by the soul, not necessarily by the body itself. If a person loses both of their legs, do you believe that that person is somehow less of the individual of who they were because they have their legs missing? The body is one thing. The identity is something else. The school, I would argue, is the identity of that particular building. The building is just a building. That education process does not need to explicitly take place in a building. But if you, as the education secretary, need to come up with provisions in order to figure out how to make that work, that is your job. I am unclear on what you do on a daily basis. And especially now that you have something that is a clear priority, clearly for Trump and clearly for you, you all of a sudden don't want to do the hard work, the labor associated with ensuring that those kids are safe. How pathetic you are. How pathetic. How unempathetic and just downright disgusting of a person that is absolutely willing to put kids in harm's way for some kind of ideological agenda. There's a little bit more to this. I'm going to let Dana Bash push back on it. But if you want to know the type of person that Betsy Devos is, putting kids in jeopardy of death, or for that matter, in jeopardy of spreading death, without any clear way of doing so, is who Betsy DeVos is.
The school in the city of Detroit are very,
Right.
in my home state, in the city of Detroit, would be very different than that of a school in the Upper Peninsula
exactly,
of Michigan.
and that's the point. That's completely understandable. But you are arguing over and over that they should handle this on a local level. But at the same time, as the Secretary of Education, you are trying to push them to do a one-size-fits-all approach, which is go back and reopen schools. You can't have it both ways.
I am urging all schools to be to open and to be providing their students a full-time education.
She doesn't know how to do it. She just wants you to do it. Now, imagine for the moment, with all of these places, I've shown you just a snapshot of how COVID-19 has been spreading. Herd immunity, nope. Arizona, 97% capacity, asking for prison trucks, morgue trucks, refrigerated trucks. 90% of the ICUs in Florida are full. Houston hospitals left in the ER because of, again, being full. The death rate going up. And this notion that kids are immune is nonsense. I can show you kid after kid after kid based on medical studies that got ill, especially with kids with comorbidities that complicate the virus itself. With all of this evidence, with all of this information, with the virus, even the numbers of deaths surging now, back up to their regular one. I remember this number was 200 at one point. This number is now at 731. And if we go back to 2 days ago, 849. Not to mention the 71,000 cases that took place on Friday. With this, they want to open back up schools and have no clear pathway in which to do so safely. That's astonishing. They're even putting kids on the axe. Marcus Will, why doesn't Black Lives Matter consider social distancing? Marcus, I'm not quite sure how that's relevant. I'm making the point to you that your schools are being open with your kids being put on the front lines of potential death, especially the potential of spreading the virus, even when you have this situation with the numbers swelling. And your response is, why doesn't Black Lives Matter social distance? You realize that Black Lives Matter in regards to an organization is separate and distinct from protests that are taking place all across the country, including in areas where the predominance of the people who are protesting are white. I understand you got to be in your bonnet about Black Lives Matter, but this goes beyond them. Robert Bouquet Ray, Betsy promotes survival of the fittest, but it is her system that is falling apart. Failing to adapt. Well, she doesn't care. I think that's the issue. And, we have right-wingers with the stuff. They don't necessarily care. Donald Trump, think of it in these terms. Donald Trump, when he was trying to build this wall, he literally allowed for hundreds, thousands of people to go without a paycheck, working at the TSA and working at the various airports. He knew he was doing it. He knew that the wall wasn't necessarily necessary. He understood the consequences, meaning people were going to go without a paycheck for months on end, and he did it anyway. He did not care about the real material circumstances that the people were living through. This is kind of a right-winger thing. Same thing with this. Betsy Devos does not care about the real material circumstances that people are living through. She has an ideological disposition brought about entirely by her wealth and her class. And in doing so, you have something that you're giving this person governance over people to which she has zero connection to. And we're expecting an outcome that requires, to some degree, a connection. No, this is the exact outcome that you would expect from somebody like this. And for that matter, you'd expect from a Trump administration or people in the Trump administration. The fact of the matter is a lot of people are going to die as a result of these policies. Does the school systems in the various states not open? Now, the states, Trump doesn't have full authority and power over this, and it's even unclear on whether or not he can withhold funding if the states decide not to open. So we will see what happens as this gets closer. But Betsy DeVos is not necessarily having the easiest of time trying to explain the bare bones truth of the matter. We take a position that pretend that this shit is not real. Donald Trump wants to get reelected. He wants the society and the economies open, and in order to do so, you also have to open, to some degree, schools, because how can you open businesses but not necessarily have the rationale to open schools? We need to open it all up. We need to get everybody back to work. And whether or not people die is secondary to that process, because I want to get elected. Missing the point that he will potentially lose the election for this very specific reason, because the public acknowledges that this is a real thing and they want the real thing dealt with first. Marcus Will, isn't Black Lives Matter helping in the spread of the COVID-19 by not distancing? But that's just it. I understand that people want to point to BLM and try to make a connection, but I am telling you about your schools and those things being spread in your schools, and you're still talking about Black Lives Matter. They're unrelated. They just are. There's no connection. It's a hook into something in order to talk about something else. Look, I would tell you this. Black Lives Matter and many of the people in that protest at the very least understood and believed in wearing masks. And for that matter, gloves. That is not something that right-wingers tend to believe in. And because that is something that right-wingers tend not to believe in, they tend to balk, and you have this become somewhat of a political issue. It's not a political issue to me, it's a health issue. You can talk about Black Lives Matter and whether or not their protests spread the illness. Every research paper I've seen said no. And part and parcel to that might have been just because they actually believed in the whole mask wearing stuff, as opposed to some of these other people that didn't. Right now, though, that's irrelevant to me. The question becomes, are your kids going to either spread that virus, or are your schools adept and prepared to deal with the incoming administrations of the students if those schools have no idea on how to pull that off? And are you prepared for the discrepancies in those schools and the way they deal with those issues, as some states invariably, predictably, will have a large number of people to die as a result of failures in that process, and other states that may do better? I would tell you this right now, you have 70,000 people infected, and we are almost back up to the 1,000 rank. Is this the point where you want to bring a large number of people into a small building and then try to get those kids who often believe they're invincible to try to social distance? If you don't have to do it, it just seems lunacy to do it. Not to mention, this is a factor of state. And as a factor of state, the question becomes, is that something that you as a society want? Do you think that's safe? Is there another way to do it? Is it necessary to do it? Is it becoming a political instrument as opposed to something that's a rational action? Those are questions that should be asked, because those questions come away with the assessment that you can educate your kids in ways that don't necessarily force them to be in those buildings. And if the state, meaning the government, wants them to do that, then they need to come up with some level of guidance in order to push it, considering that many of those states are not looking for that to happen. Black Lives Matter is not a factor of policy. Black Lives Matter is an institution unto itself. The people who go out and protest are institutions unto themselves. They're not working under the auspices of state, or for that matter, government. This is a factor of government. And if this factor of government does something or takes a policy that is entirely ideological that gets your kids killed, that matters. And so the BLM stuff doesn't apply. What does apply is whether or not this is going to be safe, and whether or not the state can ensure that your kids going back to those schools are indeed safe. This is an ideological disposition from Betsy Devos. And unfortunately, that ideological disposition is going to get kids killed. Like, share, and of course,